Hello, Mzansi. You are listening to Farmers Inside Track, proudly brought to you by Food Forum Mzansi. My name is Patricia Tembo, your host, and welcome to episode 555. Today, we're looking at how to set up grazing camps. So this episode is set to be both informative and practical as we welcome Patrick Rakau, who is a rangeland scientist at the Agricultural Research Council. Patrick Rakau, welcome back to Farmers Inside Track. We're glad to have you on today's episode once again. We had a really informative podcast episode the last time you were on, so I know today's episode is going to be just as good. Welcome to Farmers Inside Track.
Thanks once more, and thanks for the opportunity and the invite again.
Awesome. So for our listeners who are maybe not familiar with you, haven't listened to the previous podcast that we had where you spoke about, how to establish your own pasture as a farmer. So for farmers who are completely unfamiliar with the work that you're doing, Patrick, could you give us just an overview of your work as a rangeland scientist at the Agricultural Research Council? Maybe just let us in on what your work in the agricultural sector is.
My name is Patrick Rakau, as you mentioned. I'm a researcher at the ARC under Range and Forage Sciences. I specialize in pasture science. My work scope is to evaluate forages that are coming into the country for agronomic performance and also advise farmers with different pastures that can be planted in our different ecological zones. I'm also responsible for a national project, cover crop and fodder bank production, which is funded by National Department of Agriculture under Land Care, and it's a 5-year project. The main objective of the project is to bring in smallholder farmers into the seed industry and also to produce fodder for our animals so that we can be able to provide feed during winter and the disaster conditions.
Thank you, Mr. Rakau, for that overview of the work that you are doing. And, going into today's topic, I have heard the idea that as a livestock farmer, you are primarily or first and foremost a grass farmer. So today we're looking at how our farmers can set up grazing camps and the importance of setting up grazing camps. So I think to start off the conversation, what are grazing camps and why are they important for rangeland management?
Grazing camps are subdivided sections of rangeland fenced off to manage livestock in a controlled manner. So instead of allowing your animals to roam free over a large area continuously, the land is divided into smaller units and animals or livestock are moved between them according to the planned grazing system. So the importance of these camps is to control grazing, reduce selection of palatable species, and creating a room for recovery of our graze plant or crops.
Listening to you now mentioning one of the purposes is reducing grazing of palatable species. I don't know if it's something we'll go into later in the conversation, but I'm just curious about that point as to why the goal would be to reduce the grazing of palatable grass species. Is that something maybe you'll unpack later, or would you rather speak about that now?
I think it's important that I can speak about it now so that the listeners can follow. Palatable species are those natural species that have high nutritional value. We talk about ICP, crude protein, which is the element that is responsible for our animals gaining weight, producing high. So because they are palatable, animals naturally, they will start grazing them. And when they finish grazing them, they will go to the semi-palatable, and lastly, they will go for unpalatable. So if I give an example, it's like a dish where there is a meat, raw or vegetable, and pap. So automatically, if you do selection, people will go for meat first because it's nice, it's tender, and so forth. After finishing the meat, they can go eat now vegetable. Up until there's nothing, then they can eat pap. So animals are like that. And if your camps are not controlled, they will select for their own. So the camps help that. We force them to graze even palatable species or semi-palatable species because they are controlled environment. So In that way, we know that palatable will be heavily grazed, and for them to recover, we need to give that camp a rest. So that's why I'm saying grazing camps are important to reduce selection of palatable species or overgrazing of palatable species.
Looking at grazing camps, the research is that they actually improve the veldt condition and carrying capacity. How does this happen?
It's important that one understand the field condition score of the camp or of the farm, because that is the critical stage to start dividing your camps. You need to understand what type of species are you working with. Remember, in nature, in rangeland, we adjust, we don't manipulate the environment. So if your camp is dominated by loam soil, for example, and then the species that performs well there, they are semi-palatable. So you must work with those species to provide feed for your livestock, or else they will lose weight, then they will starve and you won't make money. So it's important that farmers understand their lands or their farms. So by doing field assessment, condition score is important, because you are going to identify how many species dominate in your camp, how is their palatability, and all that information. The cover is going to help you to calculate what we call field condition score, which will determine the carrying capacity of your farm and also the stocking rate of your farm.
One would assume that a farmer should take care of the veldt condition because it will also help in terms of feed costs and animal nutrition. So looking at that aspect, how does having well-planned grazing camps influence feed costs and overall animal performance in terms of nutrition? Is there benefit to having well-planned grazing camps in terms of that?
It has a huge benefit, because if you have a well-planned camps, you will be able to provide sufficient nutrients feed for your livestock throughout the year. Remember, we only have one growing season per year. So it means in these 12 months, only 3 months you will be receiving rainfall. That's what rangeland depends on. But our animals graze or need feed every day. So if you don't have well-planned grazing camp, you're going to overgraze your palatable species, and then come winter or off-season, your plant goes to dormant stage and they lose palatability, and the nutrients that they need for animals to maintain their body weight, they will not be able to get it from the natural grasses that are there. Then that will lead to you as a farmer to pop up money to buy supplements, which are very, very expensive, because a livestock need 7% of CP to gain weight or to maintain its body weight. So most of unpalatable species, they have less than 5 crude protein percentage. So if your camp is dominated by those, that means you need plus minus 3 to reach to 7%, so that your animals can maintain their body weight and perform. So that 3%, you won't get it anywhere. That means you have to source it from supplementary feeding or planted pastures. So that needs money, and it's very expensive to buy those supplements.
So now looking at actually setting up the grazing camps, what does the farmer need to consider in terms of dividing the land and just, I suppose, setting up the system?
There are several factors that a farmer should consider. The first one is field type. Field type, we have different field types. We have sour field, mixed field, and sweet field. And these different types of fields in types of fields in South Africa, they differ in their rainfall levels. So a farmer must also consider the topography, which is the slope of the farm. Is your farm in a mountainous area or in a flat slope? That will also influence the runoff. When it rains, are you going to reduce rainfall, or you're going to reduce soil erosion through rain, or are you going to apply other method to control that if you are in a steep farm? Also, the soil type. Are you working with loam soil, sandy loam? Because these soils also influence the type of vegetation that you are going to have, and also the water holding capacity. When it rains, does your sandy soil compared to a loam soil, which one can hold more water holding capacity. And all this will help you to be able to get your carrying capacity. You must also know the rainfall patterns. You will find the farmers in Limpopo, that this different district of Limpopo, their environmental conditions not the same. Their rain pattern is not the same, even though they all receive summer rainfall. But you find on the side of Umahua's Zanini, it's a forest vegetation and it's a high rainfall. But you come down to the Palale, it's very hot. So those are the things that a farmer must consider. And lastly, the size of the camp and the water availability, because you can't put your animals in a camp where they will not be able to access drinking water.
And thinking of the farmers who may have limited resources and even space, maybe a communal farmer or communal farmers, they're sharing land. So how does setting up grazing camps look in situations or scenarios like that where there's limited resources or space or shared farming space or pasture? What is your advice in terms of setting up grazing camps in those conditions?
We all know that farming is very expensive, but it has a reward if you manage it, thinking about income and benefits that you'll get. So I advise that farmers must work in groups, not individual. Let's say a certain community, we have 10 families owning a head of cattle or a small stock. Then they must work together to assist each other in buying the fence, because there's no way that you will divide the camps without separating them, because if you don't separate them, animals will move freely or will jump whatever the demarcation that you put and go to the next camp anytime. So fencing is the only way to separate the camps, and that fencing must be in a good condition so that animals don't gain access to the other camp, because it's reserved for a certain purpose.
Looking at a rotational system, I suppose the idea of a grazing camp, for it to work as a rotational grazing system, how many camps should a farmer aim to have?
Farmers must have 4-camp system. This is a 4-camp system that us as researchers support, because it was researched and it has shown result. The reason why I suggest a 4-camp system is that I explained initially and say we only receive rainfall in summer in most part of England. Only 3 to 4 provinces that receive winter rainfall, which is in KZN, Eastern Cape and Western Cape. So other 6 provinces will receive rain in summer. And the 4-camp system will assist you to rest each camp once a year to receive full growing season. What do I mean by receiving full growing season? If we have 4 camps, we have camp A, B, C, and D, and we have 12 months of the year. So that means in camp 1, you will rest for 3 months. Camp 2, 3 months. Camp B, 3 months. Camp C, 3 months. Camp D, 3 months, which is 12 months. So in these 12 months, the only camp that will benefit the rest is the one that will be rested in growing season, meaning November, December, January. So far, that is our ideal growing season where we receive rainfall. So 2026, Camp A is rested in November, December, January, which is our growing season. Then the 3 ones, B, C, and D, you will use them to rotate your livestock throughout the other remaining 9 months, so that come winter, then you will graze this one that was rested for a growing season for the whole winter. Why? There will be enough fodder, there will be enough material for animals to graze, because it was rested throughout the growing season. These other 3, they will look like heavily grazed because they were grazed continuously. And second year, then you give Camp B the rest in growing season. So in every year, you will rest 1 camp, and that camp is we call it ICU. That's where all your animals that are severely affected by weight or whatever you are farming with, then you put them there, because there is enough natural fodder, by the way. The one that you don't have to buy, God just gave you that one. Then you will be able to go through the winter and the early spring, where it's a challenge for most of the farmers as we speak. So this 4-camp system, no matter how you explain it, no matter how you apply it, you will be able to survive the winter. The main thing is to survive winter and early spring. But if you have limited camps or you don't rest your camp in growing season, it will be difficult for your vegetation or your fodder to take you throughout the winter and the early spring seasons.
Seraka. So a 4-camp system is recommended by researchers like yourself. So I'm thinking in terms of the herd size, does this influence, is the 4-camp standard despite the herd size? So in terms of determining how many animals would be in a certain camp, how can a farmer go about that? How is that determined?
Stocking rate is derived from carrying capacity. For you to have carrying capacity, to know carrying capacity, you must do field conditions score. So they go hand in glove. So the first step, you know your grazing field condition score, which you will be able to calculate carrying capacity, and in turn, you bring in the stocking rate. So the Camp 4 system doesn't matter how big is your herd, but you need it so that even if your herd is so small, but remember the grasses will only grow in summer. So you need to rest that one camp in summer. Some farmers, commercial farmers, they opt to do 3-camp system, which is now, it will be 4 months, 4 months, 4 months. And then it's a little bit longer, but it depends on the situation by situation to say, is this farmer able to supply supplementary feed during those severe periods whereby the natural grasses cannot take it anymore? So the answer mostly in our communal farmers or emerging farmers is no, because they depend purely to rain-fed. So 4-camp system for them is a starting point. And once they master it, then you can start play around with figures. The stocking rate, you just play around with the figures to say, my camp total stocking rate is 10 animals per year. Then I divide it by 4. So you can either overstock and reduce the time of stay, or understock, put them a little bit longer. So the stocking rate differs by the farming system that the farmer is working on. But to get a stocking rate, you need these 3. You need field assessment score, calculation, and you need carrying capacity. Then it will give you stocking rate. From there, you can play around with the numbers based on your system.
Looking now at how long animals should stay on a camp, what is the recommendation?
The recommendation is that farmers must understand or have a intimacy relationship with their camps. Once you put your animals there, you need to go and observe the grazing pattern. One of the skills that farmers must have is that they must understand the grazing pattern to say, when I brought these animals in, let's give an example, my grass were 30 centimeter high. But after a week now, they grazed, it's now 20 meter high. So the moment you see that the camp is a little bit overgrazed, as we know that first observation will be palatable species will be heavily grazed. But you don't want them to be more grazed because they will disappear, because once the animals start removing the plant canopy where the nutrients are stored for the regrowth, then that particular grass will die because it doesn't have leaves to produce its own food through photosynthesis process. As we know, it needs leaves. So you need to monitor your camps in such a way that your palatable species are not overgrazed so that they can be able to come back, because those are your key in maintaining your animals. So you want to conserve them, you want to make them to multiply, and for them to multiply, you need to give them a time to reproduce seeds, for example, so that they can multiply in your camp. But if you hammer them by grazing heavily, then you will left no choice but they will disappear. And then when they disappear, invader species or a wheat will take over. Palatable species, because they are not grazed, they reach maturity stage, they flower, they produce seeds, they spread the seeds, they take over your camp. In a long run, your field condition score deteriorated dramatically, and then you can't even maintain even one animal for the whole year. So such knowledge or skill, it's needed for farmers to say, understand your field condition, your type of vegetation that you have, and once you put animals, don't put them for the whole 3 months and leave, come after 3 months. No, Sometimes you find or plan to put them 2 weeks, but due to the severe damage that they are causing, you will move them. That's why you have 4 camp system. That the other camp is always, I call it ICU. When things are not working, you put animals there, even if you put them for a week, so that you can give those grasses that are heavily affected a breath so that they can come back naturally. We do it naturally, and naturally we know we need leaves, and livestock graze leaves. So if they overgraze, that means that grass is no longer having leaves, and that will not take place. That plant cannot produce its own food. It will eventually disappear.
And you mentioned that one of the important skills that a farmer should have is observing the grazing patterns. So looking at that point you've mentioned, what signs should farmers look for when they're observing the grazing patterns and the condition of the veldt to know if it's working or not, and if they are seeing problems, if it's attributed to the grazing system or if it's other factors, maybe like climates or weather conditions, like a drought, for example? What are the signs that will help a farmer assess the grazing patterns that they have?
The first one is to observe the bare patches. When you bring in animals, every part of the camp was covered by grasses. And then if you start seeing bare patches, spaces between those plants, that means those plants that were there, they were heavily grazed and they are palatable species. So that is a sign that now you are tapping into the wrong side, because they will eventually finish those palatable species. So you must avoid to have bare patches amongst your veldt. Secondly, you also monitor their movement. If animals in a camp, they concentrate on one side, that means that side is the one that is having palatable species, as I explained earlier. And you know they will finish that one before they can go to the other side. So in that way, to rescue that palatable species, you can be forced to remove them because you are saving the palatable species. And by removing them just for a week, then when you bring them, maybe they can start grazing on the other side, because now the field or the vegetation on the other side is a little bit greener, or vigor is higher than the one that they grazed. And that will help you to save your farm. But if you are not observing, you are not checking, they will stay in that corner. At the end, the whole palatable species are removed, and then you are left with unpalatable species. So that's my advice, to say every morning, check your camps. If you are a farmer, check the camps that your animals are. Then you check to say, how is the grazing pattern? And then how severe it is, and then is there a need to rescue them or to move them to the next camp?
Closing off the conversation, how often should farmer assess the veldt condition?
I suggest yearly assessment, because remember, the first assessment is done by the experts. Let's say us as pasture scientists or rangeland expertise, they come to your field conditions code, they give you a report to say, this is how you must put your animals per year. Then you divide your camps, and then you separate your camps based on the advice. But every time you put your livestock inside those camps, they're experiencing something different, and the response won't be consistent or similar always. So every year, do a reassessment, and you must make sure you master it. A simple observation can help to say, I know my camp used to be dominated by Synchras ciliaris or panicle maxima. So you must check, it's still dominating that palatable buffalo grass. If you see that it's starting to decrease, you want to be able to see that it's decreasing, unless you do field assessment score to say, in that one, remember I talked about the ICU. In the ICU, you'll have a corner where you use it as a benchmark. Benchmark, it means that corner represents the whole camp. So every time when you do field assessment to check, in my benchmark, I used to have 10 different species in this camp. Am I still having them? You'll find in 2 years' time, 2 have already disappeared. Why? Because they were overgrazed. You didn't give them time to recover. So that will be an indicator to you to say, you are doing something wrong. You must change, or you must reduce your stocking rate. So you need to do it annually. I know farmers will say they are busy and the time is money, but remember, this is a natural gift. You are not paying anything for those species, for that rate. You just have to manage it and adjust. But if you fail to do that, then you will be faced with expensive systems now, planted pastures, supplement, feeding, and all those kind of things, which is more expensive than you managing that natural one correctly.
The last thought to touch on in the episode is looking at conservation agriculture and how setting up grazing camps would fall under practicing conservation agricultural practices. Maybe if you can speak us through that and how it supports things like soil cover and why that's important again for the farmers who are listening.
The conservation agriculture, it's very important and is the way to go. Let me start by saying that, because why am I saying that? There are three principles of conservation agriculture. It's cover, crop rotation, and no-till. These three is key in managing those camps, because when you rest your camps, you are creating conducive room for those plants to regrowth and reproduce seeds and multiply. And then because some plants are increases, decreases, when you cut them or when you graze them, they increase. So you need to activate that by bringing in animals. So when you bring in animals, those animals help you to build organic matter into the soil, because when animals start to graze or grab or cut, those grasses push down the carbon into the soil in a way of defending itself. And now they are doing what? They are increasing carbon content into the soil, and then they activate. So you are killing two birds with one stone, because you rested your camp, you are bringing in animals, and when they are grazing, they are busy building up organic matter or essential elements into the soils that you will need for the regrowth of the same plants, because you want to maintain those plants. You can't plant anything in a natural field unless it's planted pastures. And those processes, all of them, they constitute conservation agriculture. So conservation agriculture, in my understanding, it's a way to go, because I'm experiencing this even now when I'm leading this cover crop and fodder bank production project. It's under conservation agriculture. So you can't separate soil, plant, and animals, because they work hand in glove. That's why even when God was giving us the Garden of Eden, there were animals and plants and crops. And so we need grasses, soil to be in a good quality. It needs grasses, and grasses need soil, and the opposite is true. And also animals, so that when they graze them, they stimulate the regrowth. When they stimulate the regrowth, they increase the vigor. When they increase the vigor, the leaves, photosynthesis takes place, the soil is covered, they retain moisture, there's no erosion caused by rain, because the drops hit on the covered soil, not on the bare soil. So you are now doing it naturally. So that is the most fascinating way of understanding conservation agriculture and the systems that we are working with currently.
You put it so well, just how everything is dependent on each other. You can't separate the soil from the vegetation or the grass and the animals. Thank you so much, Mr. Rakawa. I don't know if there's anything else that you would like to touch on before we close the podcast episode.
Thanks. I just want to acknowledge the support that the National Department of Agriculture is funding research currently. And not only the cover crop project or fodder bank production, all the projects that the country needs under animal nutrition, home, animal performance, genetics, you name them. Our government is really doing a good work by supporting those initiatives, those research that are addressing national crisis. So, which is something that we were not getting previously. Researchers were always complaining to say, we don't have funding. But I'm telling you, from last year when we had the podcast and up to now, they are supporting financially, they support research and creating jobs also, even though they're temporary jobs. But if you got a 5-year contract job, it's an opportunity. In that 5 years, you can change a lot of things and get a permanent position. So I just want to acknowledge the National Department of Agriculture, more especially under Land Care, that we really appreciate their support, and we will do our best to make sure that we bring quality research to our people. Thank you.
Is there a way for farmers to know more about grazing camps from you?
If they want to know more about the grazing crops and anything related to forage or seed production, conservation, agriculture, planted pastures, rangeland, they can contact me on my email address, rakaup@arc.agric.za. Drop in the email and then I will come back to them and assist where we can, because the good thing is that the Cover Crop project is a national project. So I'm all over the country with the technicians in each province and the extension officers and the support staff. So we are all over the country. Just drop an email and then we'll be happy to assist.
Thank you so much to Patrick Rakau, who is a rangeland scientist at the Agricultural Research Council. For more information on the topic, you can visit www.foodforumzansi.co.za. And that brings us to the end of this episode. Remember to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. From myself, Patricia Tembo, our technical producer, Megan van der Vent, and the rest of #Team Food Forum Zanzi, thank you for listening and keep growing with us.